The first chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire begins in the suffocating stillness of the pre-cosmic gray. This is the narrative ontological revolution, where the physical architecture of the world, the archtrees and the crags, represented the total absence of change. Within the fog and the unmoving stone, the world existed in a state of eternal stagnation, a time before life, death, light, or shadow. The lore of this era is the lore of the Great Disparity. Its purpose was the violent introduction of contrast into a uniform universe. The history of the first flame is the history of the first spark, where a single event of spontaneous combustion beneath the earth created the boundaries that define existence. This is the tragedy of the burning beginning, proving that life is a flame that consumes the gray to establish the self. The lore of the ancient dragons and the Age of Ancients provides the biological and environmental foundation for this chapter's transition. These immortal beings, possessing stone scales and existing outside the cycle of life and death, represented the perfection of the static. The lore suggests that the dragons were the architects of the void. Their purpose was the maintenance of the eternal present. By existing without desire or decay, the dragons proved that stability is the ultimate state of the unkind-led world, showing that immortality is a stasis that denies the soul. This reveals the axiomatic purpose of the gray. The world was a monument to nothingness before the fire provided a reason to exist. This was the era of the archtrees. This shows that the history of the ancients is a history of the infinite, which grinds the concept of time into a meaningless dust. The physical environment of the deepest caverns provides insight into the geological birth of the flame. Beneath the roots of the world, in a place untouched by the wind of the surface, a spark appeared in the dark. This was the first disparity, representing the emergence of warmth in a cold universe. The lore of the first flame explains that its purpose was the biological ignition of the multiverse. By creating light and dark, and life and death, the flame proved that conflict is the necessary fuel for consciousness, showing that reality is a friction. This reveals the administrative purpose of the spark. The flame provided the lords with the currency of power. This was the era of the discovery. This shows that the history of the fire is a history of the separation, which uses heat as a weapon against the eternal. The relationship between the progenitor souls and the manifestation of divinity represents the hierarchical birth within the narrative. From the flame, for great beings emerged to claim the Lord souls, representing the specialized aspects of the new existence. The lore suggests that these souls are the blueprints of the new order. Neto, the first of the dead, claimed the soul of death. The Witch of Izalith claimed the soul of life. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, claimed the soul of light, and the furtive pygmy claimed the dark soul. Their purpose was the categorization of the chaos. By taking these souls, they proved that divinity is a measurement of energy, showing that the gods are the first children of the burn. This reveals the heroic purpose of the Lord souls. The fire gave the weak the strength to challenge the great. Furthermore, the lore of the furtive pygmy and the forgotten shard represents the biological subversion within the fall. While the other lords sought glory and light, the pygmy claimed the smallest, darkest fragment, representing the potential for a different kind of evolution. The lore suggests that the dark soul is the seed of the human. Its purpose was the secret preservation of the flame's counterbalance. By hiding the fragment and multiplying it through the bloodline of man, the pygmy proved that strength can be found in diffusion, showing that in the Age of Fire, the smallest shadow is the longest threat. This reveals the cunning purpose of the dark soul. The pygmy created a legacy that would outlast the gods. This was the era of the primordial humanity. The relationship between the Great War and the fall of the Archtrees represents the industrial destruction of the Old World. To establish their kingdom, the lords had to dismantle the Grey, representing the violent necessity of progress. The lore suggests that the war was the genocide of the Eternal. Its purpose was the clearing of the cosmic stage. By using the lightning of Gwyn to peel the scales of the dragons and the fire of the witch to burn the trees, the lords proved that disparity is an aggressor, showing that creation requires total erasure. This reveals the violent purpose of the age. The fire must kill the void to rule the earth. This was the era of the dragon slaying. This shows that the history of the war is a history of the ash, which turns the immortal into a grave. The lore of the first spires and the rise of Lordran represents the architectural triumph of the new regime. Once the dragons were defeated, the lords built their cities on the peaks, proving that the high ground belonged to the burned. The lore suggests that Lordran is the altar of the flame. Its purpose was the standardization of the divine sovereignty. By building Aenorlando and Izalith, the lords confirmed that civilization is the structure of the flame, showing that the world now recognizes the heat. This reveals the narcissistic purpose of the kingdom. The gods built a mirror of the fire to celebrate their escape from the gray. The act concludes with the silent observation of the first flame in its prime, realizing that the spark was not just a light, but a countdown. The purpose of the first flame lore was to be the universal exposure of the cost of disparity. It shows that life is a temporary state of agitation. The player realizes that Lordran is a castle built on a wick. The rise of the lords is the final movement of the foundation lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, existence is not a right, it is a consumption that exhausts the source to satisfy the vision. The legacy of the first flame in this chapter is the horror of the emergence. We realize that stability was a cold mercy and fire was a tether that the lords used to anchor the world to the reality of their own ambition. The purpose of the workshop of the spark was to inventory the life, and the fall was the beginning of the end. As the flame roars and the dragons fall, hearing the crackle of the fire echoing through the empty sky, they understand that the history of the flame is the history of the debt. A debt that gives the gods their might but leaves the universe to wither in the shadow of the light. The second chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the political zenith of the celestial regime. This is the narrative sovereign expansion, where the physical architecture of the world, the sprawling bridges and fortified walls of the early age, represents the absolute confidence of the Lord of Sunlight. Within the radiant glow of the early flame and the synchronized march of 1,000 boots, the world witnessed the theological solidification of law. The lore of this era is the lore of the solar mandate. Its purpose was the cultural standardization of the divine will. The history of Gwyn's reign is the history of the great organization, where the chaos of the spark was channeled into legislation, military, and architecture. This is the tragedy of the high noon, proving that sovereignty is a force that freezes the fluidity of life to create the stability of empire. The lore of Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, and the paternal authority provides the biological and spiritual foundation for this chapter's dominance. As the primary victor of the War of the Ancients, Gwyn used the light of the first flame to construct a family and a hierarchy, representing the creation of order out of the void. The lore suggests that Gwyn is the icon of the uncontested origin. Its purpose was the manifestation of the patriarchal order. By dividing his power among his children and knights, Gwyn proved that divinity can be delegated to control the geography, showing that authority is a distribution of light. This reveals the structural purpose of the sun. The Lord became the sun to ensure the world never lost its shadow. This was the era of the Sunlight Covenant. This shows that the history of the king is a history of the anchor, which holds the world in a permanent day. The physical environment of the early citadel of Aenorlando provides insight into the metropolitan ambition of the fall. This was a construction phase where the gods defined the sky as their province, representing the separation of the divine from the soil. The lore of the Silver Knights explains that its purpose was the kinetic defense of the new reality. These untarnished warriors policed the borders of the divine realm, proving that order requires steel to persist, showing that peace is a garrison. This reveals the defensive purpose of the Legion. The gods used the noble to enforce the distance. This was the era of the Dragonslayer Great Shield. This shows that the history of the knight is a history of the wall, which turns loyalty into a fortification. The relationship between the four knights of Gwyn and the division of labor represents the functional specialization within the narrative. Each knight, Ornstein, Artorias, Kieran, and Goff, held a unique role in the divine machine, representing the fragmentation of Gwyn's will into expertise. The lore suggests that the four are the pillars of the sun. Their purpose was the management of specific threats to the age. By assigning the lion to dragons, the wolf to the dark, the hornet to the shadows, and the hawk to the sky, Gwyn proved that power must be specialized to govern the complex, showing that in Lord Ran, greatness is a vocation. This reveals the organizational purpose of the Round Table. The gods segmented the world to control the risk. This was the era of the Four Rings. Furthermore, the lore of the Covenant of the Way of White and the human tether represents the theological subjugation within the fall. Beyond the walls of the gods, Gwyn established a religion for men to follow, representing the spiritual domestication of the Pygmies' descendants. The lore suggests that the Way of White is the cradle of the obedient. Its purpose was the management of the human potential. By teaching men to worship the sun, the gods proved that faith is a tool of surveillance, showing that in Lord Ran, religion is the chain that binds the dark to the altar. This reveals the clerical purpose of the church. The gods created the saint to stifle the hollow. This was the era of the Lloyd's talisman. The relationship between the firstborn and the paradox of war represents the internal fragmentation within the fall. Gwyn's eldest son, the god of war, lost his status and identity for allying with the dragons, representing the intolerance of the solar order for deviance. The lore suggests that the Nameless King is the error in the divine code. Its purpose was the demonstration of the price of betrayal. By erasing his name from history, Gwyn proved that legacy is subject to compliance, showing that in Anerlando, truth is a sculpture that can be shattered. This reveals the sensorial purpose of the exile. The father kills the memory of the son to save the image of the empire. This was the era of the sunlight metal. The lore of the Great Warp and the transit of the lords represents the spatial sovereignty within the narrative. The gods traveled between the peaks and the deep using magic that men could not understand, proving that the distance between realities was controlled by the throne. The lore suggests that teleportation is the divine privilege. Its purpose was the maintenance of the global speed. This reveals the logistical purpose of the transit. The gods shrank the world to rule it instantly. This shows that the history of the warp is a history of the shortcut, which turns geography into a suggestion. The act concludes with the silent observation of the great solar eclipse, realizing that the sun was at its highest point just as the shadows began to lengthen at the base. The purpose of the Lord of Sunlight lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the divine center. It shows that empire requires vision to build but blood to keep. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a clock that Gwyn wound too tight. The rise of the kingdom is the final movement of the Zenith lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, order is not a gift. It is a construction that exhausts the free to satisfy the crown. The legacy of Gwyn in this chapter is the horror of the sovereign expansion. We realize that nobility was a bloody program and light was a tether that the king used to anchor the world to the reality of his own pride. The purpose of the workshop of the sun was to catalog the glory, and the fall was the silent approach of the evening. As the sun burns white and the silver armor gleams, hearing the clank of the shields echoing through the city, they understand that the history of the sun is the history of the mask, a mask that gilds the world to hide the flicker of the dying fire. The third chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the biological catastrophe of the Southern Reaching. This is the narrative experimental hubris, where the physical architecture of the world, the lava-drowned spires and root-choked ruins of lost Izalith, represents the desperate panic of the life soul. Within the choking heat of the subterranean magma and the wet rattle of mutating flesh, the world witnessed the theological abortion of a new Sunday. The lore of this era is the lore of the bed of chaos. Its purpose was the artificial resurrection of the universal heat. The history of the witch is the history of the great blasphemy, where the mistress of sorcery attempted to duplicate the first flame to save her status, resulting in the perversion of evolution. This is the tragedy of the forced birth, proving that creation is a sacred balance that cannot be manufactured by the will. The lore of the Witch of Izalith and the mastery of flame provides the spiritual foundation for this chapter's ruin. As one of the original lords who claimed a soul from the first flame, the witch and her daughters of chaos commanded the fire as an art, representing the domesticated power of destruction. The lore suggests that the witch is the icon of the maternal ambition. Its purpose was the preservation of life through intellectual mimicry. By attempting to forge a new flame with her soul, the witch proved that power without humility is suicide, showing that divinity is a unique event. This reveals the subversive purpose of the creation. The lords tried to play nature to avoid the dark. This was the era of the fire sorcery. This shows that the history of the witch is a history of the hubris, which turns knowledge into a pyre. The physical environment of Lost Izalith provides insight into the ecological failure of the fall. This is a city consumed by its own power, representing the hostility of nature when it is twisted by sorcery. The lore of the Chaos Flame explains that its purpose was the inversion of the natural order. Instead of providing light, this false fire produced mutation and madness, proving that life can become a tumor. This reveals the biological purpose of the magma. The gods accidentally bred a hell to escape a grave. This was the era of the orange charred ring. This shows that the history of the city is a history of the flood, which uses lava as a shackle. The relationship between the daughters of chaos and the sacrificial degradation represents the familial collapse within the narrative. The witch's offspring were transformed into monstrous hybrids, spiders, insects, and weeping ghosts, representing the price of the mother's sin. The lore suggests that the sisters are the witnesses of the deformity. Their purpose was the embodiment of the failed transcendence. By becoming the Quelag and the Fair Lady, they proved that beauty is fragile in the presence of chaos, showing that in Izalith, love is a burden of pus. This reveals the tragic purpose of the mutation. The gods turned their children into walls to contain their mistake. This was the era of the chaos storm. Furthermore, the lore of the demons and the new taxonomy represents the spiritual alienation within the fall. From the chaos flame, a new race of beings was born. The Capra, the Taurus, and the stray demons, representing the expulsion of the divine image from life. The lore suggests that the demon is the rejected progeny of the soul. Its purpose was the replacement of the human form. By inhabiting the crags and the ruins, the demons proved that life does not need the sun to propagate, showing that in Lordran, chaos is the anarchy of the flesh. This reveals the demonic purpose of the womb. The gods bred their own executioners. This was the era of the demon Great Hammer. The relationship between ceaseless discharge and the infinite agony represents the physical manifestation of remorse within the fall. The only son of the witch suffers from sores of fire that never heal, representing the constant pain of the chaos lineage. The lore suggests that Ceaseless is the lament of the southern kingdom. Its purpose was the guarding of the sister's grave. By leaking lava from his body, he proved that agony is the only permanent result of the new flame, showing that in Izalith, grief is a river of fire. This reveals the mournful purpose of the giant. The brother drowns the world in his tears to protect the memory of the lost. The lore of the bed of chaos and the parasitic heart represents the ontological corruption within the narrative. At the center of the ruin lies a crawlspace housing a small witch bug controlling a massive tree, proving that the Lord has become a parasite of her own creation. The lore suggests that the bed is the cradle of the end. Its purpose was the systematic consumption of the life soul. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the heart. The god becomes an insect to survive the fire. This shows that the history of the bed is a history of the regression, which turns divinity into a nuisance. The act concludes with the silent observation of the ashen remains of the daughters, realizing that the life soul was the first to flicker because it tried too hard to burn. The purpose of the chaos of life lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the biological boundary. It shows that life requires death to remain pure. The player realizes that Lost Izalith is a cancer that Gwyn feared more than the dark. The rise of the chaos is the final movement of the Izalith lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, life is not a blessing. It is a wildness that exhausts the spirit to satisfy the flesh. The legacy of the witch in this chapter is the horror of the biological catastrophe. We realize that motherhood was a bloody experiment and fire was a tether that the witch used to anchor the world to the reality of her own failure. The purpose of the workshop of the bed was to catalog the mutation, and the fall was the scream of the demon. As the roots crush the stone and the lava consumes the sky, hearing the wail of the sisters echoing through the depths, they understand that the history of the chaos is the history of the wound, a wound that bleeds fire to hide the death of the divine dream. The fourth chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the necrotic foundation of the divine order. This is the narrative systemic finality, where the physical architecture of the world, the labyrinthine tunnels and ossuary vaults of the catacombs and the tomb of the giants, represents the inevitable conclusion of all biological heat. Within the absolute darkness of the deep earth and the dry chattering of reanimated bone, the world witnessed the theological governance of the end. The lore of this era is the lore of the first of the dead. Its purpose was the ecological regulation of the soul's exit. The history of Nito is the history of the Great Rest, where the Lord of Death administered the decay of the world to prevent the contamination of the living. This is the tragedy of the Silent Warden, proving that life is a borrowing that must be repaid to the soil to maintain the cosmic debt. The lore of Gravelord Nito and the Soul of Death provides the spiritual foundation for this chapter's stillness. As one of the original lords, Nito wove the death found in the first flame into a mantle of skeletons, representing the physical embodiment of mortality. The lore suggests that Nito is the icon of the patient end. Its purpose was the management of the world's finite energy. By overseeing the rest of all beings, Nito proved that death is not an enemy, but a service, showing that divinity requires a janitor. This reveals the administrative purpose of the Gravelord. The lords created a king of the bones to ensure that the old made way for the new. This was the era of the Gravelord sword dance. This shows that the history of Nito is a history of the residue, which turns life into a deposit. The physical environment of the Tomb of the Giants provides insight into the sensory deprivation of the fall. This is a void constructed of stone and shadow, representing the isolation of the soul after the light fails. The lore of the Skull Lantern explains that its purpose was the forced recognition of the dark. In the tomb, the gods proved that vision is a privilege of the living, showing that death is the loss of perspective. This reveals the theological purpose of the deep. The gods built a prison of silence to store the truth of the flesh. This was the era of the effigy shield. This shows that the history of the tomb is a history of the blindness, which uses night as a shroud. The relationship between the necromancers and the artificial resurrection represents the bureaucratic corruption within the narrative. Beneath Nito's watch, priests of the dead experimented with eternal animation, representing the desire to bypass the natural end. The lore suggests that the necromancers are the symptoms of the mortal panic. Their purpose was the subversion of Nito's mandate. By holding lanterns that bind the skeletons to the world, they proved that man fears the grave more than slavery, showing that in the catacombs, rest is a stolen mercy. This reveals the cynical purpose of the reanimation. The weak disturb the dead to delay their own silence. This was the era of the rite of kindling. Furthermore, the lore of Pinwheel and the theft of power represents the domestic betrayal within the fall. A triple-masked parasite stole the power of the Gravelord to attempt a resurrection of a lost family, representing the fragmentation of the divine authority. The lore suggests that Pinwheel is the pathetic mimic of death. Its purpose was the demonstration of the futility of necromancy. By cloning himself in the dark, Pinwheel proved that life cannot be reassembled from ash, showing that in Lord Ran, miracles do not work in the deep. This reveals the tragic purpose of the theft. The Gravelord allowed the thief to exist as a warning. This was the era of the Mask of the Father. The relationship between the Gravelord servant and the spread of misfortune represents the epidemiological reach within the fall. Nito distributes eyes of death to his followers to infect the worlds of the living, representing the necessity of spreading the end to keep the cycle moving. The lore suggests that the Covenant is the harvest of the mortal. Its purpose was the systematic reduction of the global population. By cursing the healthy, the servants proved that death must be active to be effective, showing that in Lord Ran, quiet is a weapon. This reveals the harvesting purpose of the Eye. The gods turned mortality into a contest. This was the era of the Eye of Death. The lore of the skeletons and the kinetic stagnation represents the structural persistence within the narrative. The Undead finds that the bones reassemble themselves unless divine force is used, proving that matter resists the void. The lore suggests that the skeleton is the machine of the dead soul. Its purpose was the enforcement of the eternal boundary. This reveals the mechanical purpose of the ossuary. The gods turned the frame into a soldier to guard the exit. This shows that the history of the bone is a history of the resistance, which turns rest into a battle. The act concludes with the silent observation of the great altar of the dead, realizing that death was the only lord who stayed true to his role, while the others fled or mutated. The purpose of the administration of death lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the termination. It shows that life is a vibration that must eventually cease. The player realizes that Nito is the foundation that holds the weight of the world's failure. The rise of the grave robber is the final movement of the Nito lore, proving that in the world of dark souls, peace is not a reward. It is a darkness that exhausts the motion to satisfy the quiet. The legacy of the Gravelord in this chapter is the horror of the necrotic foundation. We realize that finality was a bloody requirement and darkness was a tether that Nito used to anchor the world to the reality of its own obsolescence. The purpose of the workshop of the grave was to inventory the decay, and the fall was the silence of the tomb. As the miasma rises and the bones clatter in the dark, hearing the sigh of the Lord echoing through the earth, they understand that the history of the grave is the history of the balance, a balance that claims the body to maintain the honesty of the soul. The fifth chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the intellectual corruption of the divine hierarchy. This is the narrative scientific sacrilege, where the physical architecture of the world, the infinite shelves and rotating staircases of the Duke's archives, represents the metastasis of ego. Within the frantic scratching of pens and the resonant humming of crystalline growth, the world witnessed the theological abandonment of sanity. The lore of this era is the lore of the scaleless betrayer. Its purpose was the systemic extraction of immortality through logic. The history of Seth is the history of the white treachery, where a lord of the Age of Ancients sacrificed the sanity of the kingdom to cure his own biological lack. This is the tragedy of the blind dragon, proving that knowledge without ethics is a crystalline cancer that consumes the future to study the past. The lore of Seth, the scaleless, and the resentment of the ancient provides the biological foundation for this chapter's subversion. Born without the stone scales that granted his kin immortality, Seth betrayed the everlasting dragons to Gwyn, representing the original sin that allowed the Age of Fire to begin. The lore suggests that Seth is the icon of the insecure genius. Its purpose was the realization of a mortality-defying science. By researching the primordial crystal, Seth proved that immortality can be manufactured through theft, showing that existence is a formula to be solved. This reveals the jealous purpose of the archive. The Duke built a library to overcome the fact of his own fragility. This was the era of the Moonlight Greatsword. This shows that the history of the dragon is a history of the envy, which turns a liberator into a vivisectionist. The physical environment of the Duke's archives provides insight into the labyrinthine insanity of the fall. This is a vertical panopticon designed to trap the mind in infinite reference, representing the god's delegation of intellect to the mad. The lore of the channelers explains that its purpose was the remote surveillance of the flesh. These six-eyed sorcerers kidnapped maidens and undead for the Duke's experiments, proving that science requires a victim, showing that progress is a predator. This reveals the clinical purpose of the tower. The archive is not a school, it is a processing plant for the soul. This was the era of the channeler's trident. This shows that the history of the Duke is a history of the kidnapping, which uses inquiry as a noose. The relationship between the Pizzicas and the failure of mutation represents the biological remorse within the fall. Behind the prison cells lie screaming blue monsters that cower in the dark, representing the former maidens of the princess transformed by crystalline logic. The lore suggests that the Pizzicas are the symptoms of the Duke's failure. Its purpose was the demonstration of the irreversibility of the research. By crying when the music plays, these creatures proved that the soul cannot be erased, only deformed, showing that in Lord Ran, curiosity is mutilation. This reveals the pathetic purpose of the dungeon. The gods allowed the scream to be archived. This was the era of the soothing sunlight. The history of the cell is the history of the sob, which echoes through the science. Furthermore, the lore of the crystal soldiers and the loss of self represents the architectural infection within the fall. The guards of the archive have been overgrown by blue geodes that control their will, representing the totalitarian nature of the Duke's atmosphere. The lore suggests that the crystal soldier is the final result of the environment. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the stagnant knowledge. By shattering into dust upon death, these soldiers proved that the mind becomes the wall it inhabits, showing that in the archives, information hardens into a prison. This reveals the rigid purpose of the infestation. The knowledge kills the host. This was the era of the crystal straightsword. The relationship between the primordial crystal and the externalized life represents the philosophical error within the fall. Seth stored his soul and immortality in a fragment of magic outside his body, proving that permanence is a fragile object. The lore suggests that the crystal is the ego of the dragon. Its purpose was the decentralization of mortality. By hiding his life in a stone, Seth confirmed that divinity is a prop that can be broken, showing that the eternal requires a garrison. This reveals the vulnerable purpose of the crystal. The god is only as strong as his library. This was the era of the soul of Seth. The lore of the moonlight butterfly and the aesthetic of the void represents the artistic deviation within the narrative. In the Darkroot Garden, artificial life forms created by Seth fly aimlessly, proving that science produces beauty that has no function. The lore suggests that the butterfly is the residual magic of the Duke. Its purpose was the colonization of the world by the crystalline will. This reveals the expansive purpose of the mutation. The dragon wanted to turn the earth into a mirror. This shows that the history of the butterfly is a history of the pollination, which spreads the crystal to satisfy the eye. The act concludes with the silent observation of the madness of the Duke, realizing that knowledge was the only lord who turned against nature to avoid the night. The purpose of the sin of the scholar lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the intellectual fall. It shows that logic is a poison when mixed with fear. The player realizes that Aner Londo is a brain that has turned on itself. The rise of the deicide is the final movement of the Seth lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, genius is not a solution. It is a mutation that exhausts the compassion to satisfy the formula. The legacy of the scholar in this chapter is the horror of the scientific sacrilege. We realize that discovery was a bloody dissection and crystal was a tether that Seth used to anchor the world to the reality of his own insanity. The purpose of the workshop of the glass was to catalog the agony, and the fall was the shattering of the mind. As the flakes of magic fall like snow, and the undead stands over the dissolving dragon, hearing the scream of the Pizzicast echoing through the books, they understand that the history of the archive is the history of the eye, an eye that sees the atom but misses the world. The 6th chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the subterranean proliferation of the divine antithesis. This is the narrative cellular insurgence, where the physical architecture of the world, the cramped shanties of Blighttown and the infinite darkness of the abyss, represents the metabolic persistence of the human. Within the damp silence of the cavernous depths and the warm pulse of the bloodline, the world witnessed the theological subversion of the solar law. The lore of this era is the lore of the furtive pygmy. Its purpose was the systemic dilution of divinity through multiplication. The history of the dark soul is the history of the quiet patient, where the smallest lord sacrificed the grandeur of light to ensure the inevitability of the dark. This is the tragedy of the shared fragment, proving that power grows when it is divided among the weak to outlast the strong. The lore of the furtive pygmy and the dark soul provides the biological foundation for this chapter's crawl. Unlike the other lords who used their souls to build thrones and monuments, the pygmy split the dark soul into countless humanities, representing the creation of the human race. The lore suggests that the pygmy is the icon of the genetic inevitability. Its purpose was the establishment of a self-replicating resistance. By hiding the Lord soul within the blood of the commoner, the pygmy proved that immortality can be hidden in fragility, showing that humanity is a fragmented godhood. This reveals the subversive purpose of the lineage. The pygmy built a tide that wait for the sun to set. This was the era of the primordial soul. This shows that the history of the human is a history of the leak, which turns a shadow into a civilization. The physical environment of the abyss provides insight into the ontological hunger of the fall. This is a non-space constructed of entropy, representing the natural gravity of the dark soul. The lore of humanity explains that its purpose was the spiritual fueling of the post-fire era. These black sprites seek warmth and connection, proving that the dark is not empty. It is thirsty, showing that existence is a crave. This reveals the visceral purpose of the void. The abyss is not a hell, it is the womb of the new order. This was the era of the dark hand. This shows that the history of the abyss is a history of the consumption, which uses emptiness as a mouth. The relationship between the 4 kings of New Londo and the temptation of the dark represents the administrative corruption within the fall. Entrusted with shards of Gwyn's soul, the kings succumbed to the art of life drain provided by Koth, representing the inevitability of the human appetite. The lore suggests that the kings are the symptoms of the solar failure. Their purpose was the demonstration of the frailty of the divine shard. By falling into the abyss, these rulers proved that the dark is more compelling than the light, showing that in Lord Ran, authority is a thin veneer. This reveals the predatory purpose of the descent. The lords tried to control the dark and were eaten by it. This was the era of the dark wraith. The history of the king is the history of the drowning, which echoes through the water. Furthermore, the lore of Manus, father of the abyss and the primordial man, represents the evolutionary trauma within the fall. An ancient pygmy was awakened and tortured by the people of Owalasile, representing the violent reaction of the dark when it is disturbed. The lore suggests that Manus is the final result of the human rage. Its purpose was the physical manifestation of the uncontrolled humanity. By dragging the city into the abyss, Manus proved that darkness becomes a monster when it is abused, showing that in the past, emotion hardens into a cataclysm. This reveals the reactive purpose of the spreading. The human kills the world that hated him. This was the era of the dark bead. The relationship between the dark sign and the circular prison represents the theological entrapment within the fall. Gwyn, terrified of the dark, branded man with a ring of fire to contain their potential, proving that the undead is a slave to the sun. The lore suggests that the dark sign is the leash of the lords. Its purpose was the forced recycling of the human soul. By turning the man into a hollow, the gods confirmed that humanity is a resource to be burned, showing that the future requires the sacrifice of the self. This reveals the incarceration purpose of the brand. The god kills the human to keep the flame. This was the era of the Way of White. The lore of the primordial serpents and the duplicity of the void represents the intellectual manipulation within the narrative. Frampt and Koth sought to guide the chosen undead toward linking or stifling the fire, proving that the dark has its own ambassadors. The lore suggests that the serpent is the conscience of the cycle. His purpose was the management of the choice. This reveals the scheming purpose of the shedding. The world is a game played by ancient lizards. This shows that the history of the serpent is a history of the tongue, which twists truth to satisfy the void. The act concludes with the silent observation of the deepest humanity, realizing that the pygmy was the only lord who won by losing. The purpose of the shadow of the pygmy lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the genetic fall. It shows that light is a flicker while dark is a flood. The player realizes that man is the inheritor who wait in the basement of the gods. The rise of the Dark Lord is the final movement of the pygmy lore, proving that in the world of dark souls, humanity is not a virtue. It is a patience that exhausts the lords to satisfy the night. The legacy of the pygmy in this chapter is the horror of the cellular insurgents. We realize that life was a bloody multiplication and blood was a tether that the furtive used to anchor the world to the reality of his own proliferation. The purpose of the workshop of the dark was to catalog the hollow, and the fall was the shattering of the fire. As the humanity writhes and the undead stands over the father of the abyss, hearing the moan of the dark echoing through the blood, they understand that the history of the human is the history of the shadow, a shadow that grows darker to hide the failure of the divine sun. The 7th chapter in our 8-part chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the institutional dissolution of the divine seat. This is the narrative ontological evacuation, where the physical architecture of the world, the gilded spires and empty bedchambers of Aner Londo, represents the desperate flight of the gods. Within the stagnant sunlight of the illusions and the long shadows cast by the failing hearth, the world witnessed the theological abandonment of the throne. The lore of this era is the lore of the fading flame. Its purpose was the surgical removal of the divine presence from the material realm. The history of the Twilight is the history of the Great Exodus, where the lords fled the city to avoid the dark, leaving only phantoms and mechanical sentinels to maintain the facade. This is the tragedy of the deserted heaven, proving that divinity is a cowardice that abandons the subject the moment the light begins to flicker. The lore of Guinevere, Princess of Sunlight, and the domestic mirage provides the spiritual foundation for this chapter's deception. Known as the giver of life and the symbol of fertility, her enormous form radiates a warmth that calms the violent spirit, representing the divine reward for the challenger. The lore suggests that the princess is the icon of the justified sacrifice. Its purpose was the moral validation of the linking of the fire. By appearing to the undead with open arms, the image proved that the gods are still present, showing that suffering is not in vain. This reveals the sedative purpose of the chamber. The lords created a mother to soothe the slave while they ran to Flan in distant lands. This was the era of the Sun Princess Ring. This shows that the history of the daughter is a history of the exit, which leaves a memory to guard the door. The physical environment of the darkened Aner Londo provides insight into the atmospheric desolation of the fall. This is a ghost town designed to echo the sound of loneliness, representing the true condition of the divine kingdom once the illusion is shattered. The lore of Dark Sun Gwyndolin explains that its purpose was the management of the city's decay from the shadows. As the last born of Gwyn, Gwendolyn remained to project the false sun, proving that authority requires a lie to persist, showing that governance is an illusion. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the Twilight. The city kills the clarity to save the myth. This was the era of the Dark Moon Blade. This shows that the history of the shadow is a history of the police, which uses darkness as a uniform to protect an empty cradle. The relationship between the Great Exodus and the dissolution of the family represents the social fragmentation within the narrative. One by one, the gods Flan, Guinevere, and the nameless deities fled to new cities, representing the admission of the divine failure. The lore suggests that the Exodus is the migration of the fire soul. Its purpose was the preservation of the individual god at the expense of the age. By leaving the Silver Knights to wait for an owner who would never return, the lords proved that loyalty is a one-way path, showing that in Anerlando, honor is a statue that never breathes. This reveals the selfish purpose of the departure. The father died, and the family split the inheritance. This was the era of the Tin Dark Moon Catalyst. Furthermore, the lore of the Blades of the Dark Moon and the Judicial Phantom represents the extraterritorial policing within the Fall. Gwendolyn commands a covenant of spirits who invade the worlds of those who sin against the gods, representing the long reach of the fated capital. The lore suggests that the Blades are the enforcers of the divine status quo. Its purpose was the punishment of the transgressor across the multiverse. By hunting the indicted, Gwendolyn proved that the law of Anerlando does not stop at the walls, showing that in Lordran, guilt is a beacon. This reveals the punitive purpose of the covenant. The gods used the shadow to maintain the light. This was the era of the Blue-Eye Orb. The relationship between the Serpent Frampt and the Selective Legend represents the narrative entrapment within the Fall. Kingseeker Frampt whispers into the ear of the undead, directing them toward the Lord Vessel and the fire, proving that the gods used the primordial to validate their prophecy. The lore suggests that the legend of the Chosen is the final filter of the flame. Its purpose was the psychological anchoring of the successor. By telling the undead they were special, the gods confirmed that identity is a currency to be spent at the kiln, showing that the hero is a slave with a sword. This reveals the prophetic purpose of the dialogue. The god flutters the ego to hide the ashes. This was the era of the Lord Vessel. The lore of the empty bedchambers and the domestic ghost represents the absence of the divine within the narrative. The undead finds sunlight blade and divine blessing in rooms filled with dust, proving that the gods took their clothes but left their tools. The lore suggests that the chamber is the museum of the flight. Its purpose was the silent observation of the vacancy. This reveals the haunting purpose of the architecture. The city remembers the body but prefers the glove. This shows that the history of the palace is a history of the echo, which turns home into a gallery. The act concludes with the silent observation of the sun setting forever, realizing that the gods were never present when the undead arrived. The purpose of the Twilight lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the divine desertion. It shows that sanctuary is a facade maintained by fear. The player realizes that Lordran is a corpse painted in gold. The rise of the Illusion Breaker is the final movement of the Twilight lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, truth is not a rescue. It is a violation of a sacred privacy that exhausts the god to satisfy the void. The legacy of the Pantheon in this chapter is the horror of the institutional dissolution. We realize that nobility was a bloody program and light was a tether that the moon used to anchor the world to the reality of its own extinction. The purpose of the workshop of the moon was to maintain the illusion, and the fall was the death of the image. As the sun fails and the undead stands in the empty plaza, hearing the scream of the wind echoing through the dead halls, they understand that the history of the city is the history of the lie, a lie that gilds the dark to hide the failure of the sun. The eighth and final chapter in our chronicle of the Age of Fire documents the temporal combustion of the cosmic axis. This is the narrative systemic exhaustion, where the physical architecture of the world, the ash-choked wasteland, and the sunken towers of the kiln of the first flame represents the absolute finality of the divine vision. Within the rushing wind of the cinders and the monotone gray of the world's end, the world witnessed the theological self-immolation of the origin. The lore of this era is the lore of the linking of the fire. Its purpose was the violent extension of a stagnant reality. The history of the kiln is the history of the great stoker, where the Lord of Sunlight exhausted his spirit to become the fuel for a world that refused to die. This is the tragedy of the cinder, proving that light is a cannibalism that consumes the future to preserve the shadow of the past. The lore of Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, and the Hollow King provides the spiritual foundation for this chapter's hollow end. Long after his glorious reign, the god of war and sunlight traveled to the root of the fire to offer his body to the flame, representing the ultimate failure of divinity to surrender. The lore suggests that Gwyn is the icon of the burned ego. Its purpose was the forced continuity of the solar age. By burning until only a husk remained, Gwyn proved that power can become a prison, showing that divinity is a fuel. This reveals the sacrificial purpose of the cinder. The king became the coal to ensure the world never faced the dark. This was the era of the sunlight spear. This shows that the history of the Lord is a history of the ash, which turns a god into a battery. The physical environment of the kiln of the first flame provides insight into the ecological erasure of the fall. This is a non-place constructed of residue, representing the destructive nature of eternal fire. The lore of the Black Knights explains that its purpose was the final guarding of the incineration. These charred sentinels wander the ash, their armor burnt black by the heat of the initial linking, proving that loyalty is permanent even when the soul is dust. This reveals the vigilant purpose of the remnant. The gods used the dead to protect the dying. This was the era of the Black Knight Great Axe. This shows that the history of the Guard is a history of the Char, which uses entropy as a uniform. The relationship between the choice of the undead and the forked path represents the philosophical entrapment within the narrative. Standing before the dying embers, the chosen must decide to burn or walk away, representing the final sovereignty of the pygmies there. The lore suggests that the linking is the refusal of the end. Its purpose was the management of the global transition. By replacing Gwyn with a new subject, the world confirmed that order is a cycle of sacrifice, showing that in Lord Ran, victory is a suicide. This reveals the cyclical purpose of the ending. The world requires a victim to maintain the day. This was the era of the Great Lord Greatsword. Furthermore, the lore of the Age of Dark and the Silent Throne represents the evolutionary alternative within the fall. Should the undead refuse the fire, the world plunges into absolute darkness, representing the long-delayed ascension of the human. The lore suggests that the Dark Lord is the natural successor of the flame. Its purpose was the realization of the pygmies' vision. By turning their back on the kiln, the undead proved that darkness is the inheritance, showing that in the future, existence relinquishes the sun. This reveals the liberation purpose of the night. The man kills the light to free the soul. This was the era of the Dark Lord. The relationship between the Lord Vessel and the opening of the grave represents the mechanical predation within the fall. To access the kiln, the undead fed the souls of the original lords to the fire, proving that the gods were only keys to their own destruction. The lore suggests that the vessel is the lock of the universe. Its purpose was the systematic collection of the divine heat. By satiating the altar with the souls of Nido, Seth, and Izalith, the undead confirmed that godhood is a quantity to be consumed, showing that the apex requires the death of the predecessor. This reveals the cannibalistic purpose of the access. The subject eats the divine to reach the beginning. The lore of the white ash and the muffled silence represents the atmospheric exhaustion within the narrative. The undead walks through a world that has no sound, but the wind, proving that the Age of Fire has run out of stories. The lore suggests that the ash is the final result of the ambition. Its purpose was the visual documentation of the total consumption. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the environment. The flame left nothing for the survivor. This shows that the history of the kiln is a history of the waste, which turns creation into a desert. The act concludes with the silent observation of the flickering ember, realizing that the fire was never meant to last and the lords broke the world trying to hold it. The purpose of the kiln lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the ending. It shows that order is a friction that eventually fails. The player realizes that Lord Ran is a corpse that refuses to become ash. The rise of the successor is the final movement of the Age of Fire lore, proving that in the world of Dark Souls, success is not a rescue, it is a transformation that exhausts the victor to satisfy the void. The legacy of the first flame in this final chapter is the horror of the temporal combustion. We realize that eternity was a bloody requirement and light was a tether that Gwyn used to anchor the world to the reality of his own fear. The purpose of the workshop of the kiln was to inventory the sacrifice, and the fall was the sigh of the ember. As the flame leaps or fades and the undead stands in the silent gray, hearing the roar of the fire echoing through the void. They understand that the history of the flame is the history of the end, an end that burns the gods to maintain the illusion of the day.